I want you to think back to the last time you froze. Maybe it was a job interview. Maybe it was a phone call you had been dreading for 3 days. Maybe it was something as small as a foreigner asking you for directions on the street, and instead of words, all you felt was your heart pounding and your mind going completely blank. You knew the words. You had studied them. You had written them in your notebook. You had highlighted them. You had even used them correctly in an exercise the night before. But in that moment, when it actually mattered, nothing came out. Just silence, or worse, a broken sentence that embarrassed you in front of people you wanted to impress. If this has happened to you, I need you to hear something very clearly before we go any further. This is not because you are bad at English. This is not because you are not intelligent enough, or not disciplined enough, or not talented enough for languages. I have taught thousands of students over the years, engineers, doctors, university professors, business owners, brilliant people who could solve complex problems in their own language without blinking. And yet the moment they had to speak English, they turned into someone who seemed to have forgotten how to think. That gap between what you know and what you can actually say out loud, under pressure, in real time, that gap has a name. And today, for the first time, I am going to show you exactly what is causing it and exactly how to close it. Not with more grammar rules, not with more vocabulary lists, but with something far more powerful. We are going to rewire the way your brain processes English at a physical, neurological level so that speaking stops being a performance you have to prepare for and becomes something that simply happens automatically the way it does in your native language. My name is Professor Henry, and this is English Mind Training, the channel where we do not just teach you English, we retrain your brain to use it. If you have ever felt that your English brain and your speaking mouth are two separate things that refuse to work together, today's class is going to change that. Stay with me until the end, because chapter by chapter, I am going to walk you through the real science of automatic speech, the exact daily exercises that create it, and the mental traps that are currently keeping you stuck. Traps that almost nobody talks about, because most teachers do not understand the brain deeply enough to explain them. Let us begin. Why your brain freezes when you speak English. Let me start with a question that might surprise you. When you speak your native language, do you think about grammar before you open your mouth? Do you silently construct the sentence, check the verb conjugation, decide on the correct preposition, and then speak? Of course not. The words simply arrive. You feel an intention to communicate, and your mouth produces the sentence almost before you are consciously aware of choosing it. This is what we call automatic speech, and it is the single most important concept we will discuss in this entire video, so I want you to really absorb it. Automatic speech is not something special that only native speakers are born with. It is not a gift, it is a skill built entirely through repetition, and more specifically, through a particular kind of repetition that most English learners never actually practice. Here is what happens instead. Most people learn English the way they learned mathematics in school. They learn rules, they memorize vocabulary lists, they study grammar charts with columns and exceptions. They can tell you, if you ask them directly, that the past tense of go is went, that adjectives come before nouns in English, that you should use the present perfect for an action connecting the past to the present. This is what we call declarative knowledge, and it lives in a completely different part of the brain from the knowledge that produces speech. The part of your brain responsible for fluent automatic speech is not the same part that stores grammar rules. Speech production, the actual physical act of forming words quickly and smoothly, is handled largely by what neuroscientists call procedural memory, the same system that allows you to ride a bicycle, type on a keyboard without looking at the keys, or drive a car while having a completely unrelated conversation with a passenger. Procedural memory does not care how many rules you know. It only responds to repeated physical practice. You cannot think your way into procedural fluency. You can only build it through your mouth, your ears, and thousands of repetitions. This is precisely why so many advanced learners, people who can pass written English exams with excellent scores, people who can read academic English fluently, people who understand grammar better than many native speakers, still freeze when they need to speak in real time. Their declarative knowledge, the rules stored in the thinking part of the brain, is excellent, but their procedural memory, the automatic system that should be producing speech without conscious thought, was never properly trained. So when they try to speak, their brain does something exhausting and inefficient. It pulls up the grammar rule, checks it consciously, translates the thought from their native language, rearranges the word order, and only then attempts to produce the sentence. By the time all of this mental processing happens, the conversation has already moved on, the moment has passed, and the speaker is left feeling stupid, even though they are not stupid at all. They are simply using the wrong system to try to speak. Think of it like this. Imagine you wanted to become a skilled piano player, but instead of practicing scales and pieces with your fingers, you only read books about music theory. You memorized every chord, every key signature, every rule of harmony. You could write a perfect essay about how to play a Chopin nocturne. But when you sat down at the actual piano, your fingers would not know what to do, because your fingers were never trained. The knowledge lived in your head, but not in your hands. This is exactly what happens with English learners who study grammar intensely, but never train their mouth and ears through repetition. The knowledge lives in their head, but not in their speaking muscles. There is a second, equally important reason your brain freezes, and this one is emotional rather than purely mechanical. It is called the affective filter, a term coined by the linguist Stephen Krashen, and it describes the way anxiety, fear of judgment, and self-consciousness physically block the brain's ability to access language, even language you have already learned. When you feel nervous, embarrassed, or afraid of making a mistake, your brain activates what is sometimes called the fight or flight response. Cortisol and adrenaline flood your system. Blood flow shifts away from the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for complex thought and language retrieval, and toward more primitive survival functions. In simple terms, fear physically shuts down your access to the very language centers you need in order to speak. This is why you might speak English beautifully alone in your room, rehearsing in front of a mirror, but the moment a real person is in front of you, especially someone you want to impress, the words vanish. It is not that you forgot the language. It is that fear temporarily locked the door to where the language is stored. So we have two problems working together to create the freeze you experience. First, a training problem, because your procedural memory, the automatic system, was never given enough repetition to take over speech production. Second, an emotional problem, because anxiety is blocking access to whatever language you do have stored. The good news, and I want you to really hold on to this, is that both of these problems are completely solvable. Neither of them is permanent. Neither of them means you lack talent. They simply mean you have been training the wrong way, and today we are going to fix that, chapter by chapter, starting with a deeper understanding of how the brain actually builds a new language from the ground up. How the brain actually learns a language. To understand how to rewire your brain for automatic English, we first need to understand, in simple and practical terms, what rewiring actually means. I am not going to overwhelm you with complicated neuroscience jargon. I want you to walk away from this chapter with a clear, usable mental model, something you can picture in your mind every time you practice, because understanding the mechanism behind fluency will completely change the way you train. Your brain is made of billions of neurons, and these neurons communicate with each other through connections called synapses. When you learn something new, whether it is a new word, a new grammar pattern, or a new way of moving your mouth to produce a sound that does not exist in your native language, your brain creates a new pathway between neurons. The very first time you practice something, this pathway is weak, thin, and unreliable, like a narrow dirt path through a forest that has never been walked on before. It exists, but it is fragile, and it is easy to lose your way. Now here is the crucial part. Every single time you repeat that same action, whether it is saying the same phrase, using the same grammar structure, or practicing the same sound, that pathway gets a little bit stronger. Neuroscientists describe this with a simple but powerful phrase: neurons that fire together, wire together. Repetition physically strengthens the connections between neurons. The dirt path becomes a walking trail. The walking trail becomes a paved road. Eventually, with enough repetition, that paved road becomes a highway, wide, fast, and requiring no conscious effort to travel down. This is what automatic speech actually is, at a biological level. It is a neural highway that has been built through repetition, so wide and so well established that your brain does not need to consciously search for the words anymore. They simply flow. This is also why translation is such a slow and inefficient way to try to speak English. And we will discuss this in much greater depth in the next chapter. But I want to plant the seed here. When you translate from your native language, you are not using the English highway at all. You are using your native language highway, which is already extremely strong because you have used it every day since childhood. And then you are attempting a rushed, effortful detour into English at the very last moment. This detour is slow, it is exhausting, and it is exactly why translating in your head makes you sound hesitant and delayed, even when you technically know the correct words. Now, here is something that I think will genuinely change how you think about your own learning process, and it comes from a concept called myelination. When a neural pathway is used repeatedly, the brain wraps that pathway in a fatty substance called myelin. Myelin acts like insulation on an electrical wire. It allows electrical signals to travel along the neural pathway much faster and more efficiently. The more you repeat an action, the thicker the myelin sheath becomes, and the faster and more automatic that action becomes. This is precisely why children who are immersed in a language from a young age, hearing it constantly, using it constantly, develop such incredibly fast and fluent speech. Their pathways for that language are thickly myelinated through years of constant repetition. But here is the important truth for you as an adult learner. Myelination does not stop when childhood ends. Adults can absolutely build strong, fast, myelinated pathways for a new language. It simply requires the right kind of repetition, done consistently, and this is completely within your control, starting today. I also want to address something that discourages many learners, and that is the belief that adults cannot learn languages as effectively as children because of something called the critical period, the idea that there is a biological window in early childhood after which language acquisition becomes much harder. There is some truth to this regarding the acquisition of a perfect native-like accent without any trace of a foreign accent. But when it comes to fluency, comprehension, and automatic speech production, which is what you actually care about, adults have significant advantages that children do not have. Adults have stronger analytical skills, better memory strategies, more life experience to connect new concepts to, and crucially, the ability to consciously and strategically design their own practice, which is exactly what we are doing together in this video. A child learns a language slowly through years of passive exposure with no control over their input. You, as an adult, can be far more efficient because you can deliberately choose the exercises that build automaticity fastest, rather than waiting for years of accidental exposure to do the job. There is one more piece of the puzzle I want to give you before we move forward, and it concerns the difference between input and output in the language learning process. Comprehensible input, meaning language that you can understand even if it is slightly above your current level, is what builds your internal library of vocabulary, grammar patterns, and natural phrasing. This is the foundation. But input alone does not build automatic speech. Many learners consume enormous amounts of English content, movies, podcasts, videos, and their comprehension improves significantly, yet their speaking remains slow and effortful. This is because comprehension and production are handled by partially different neural systems. Understanding English when you hear it primarily engages receptive language areas. Producing English yourself requires the motor pathways we discussed earlier, the ones responsible for actually moving your mouth, tongue, and vocal cords in the correct patterns at speed under real-time pressure. This means that to become an automatic speaker, input is necessary but never sufficient on its own. You must also engage in active output practice, repeatedly producing spoken English yourself, which is exactly what the techniques in the chapters ahead will train you to do, systematically, and efficiently, so that your speaking pathways become just as strong as your listening pathways. Understanding this model, weak pathways strengthen through repetition, myelination making them fast and automatic, the necessity of both input and active output changes everything about how you approach your daily practice. You stop asking yourself, why can't I just remember the words? And you start asking yourself the far more useful question, how many times have I actually produced this pattern out loud with my own mouth? That single shift in thinking is the beginning of real transformation, and in the next chapter, we are going to tackle the single biggest obstacle standing between you and automatic speech, a habit so deeply ingrained that most learners do not even realize they are doing it every single time they try to speak. The translation trap. I want you to imagine a woman named Amara. Amara has been studying English for 6 years. She has an impressive vocabulary. She can read English news articles without a dictionary. She scored very well on her written English exams. But when she needs to have a live conversation, something strange happens. There is always a delay, a small but noticeable pause before she responds. It is not that she does not know what to say. It is that inside her mind, a hidden process is happening every single time. A process so automatic to her now that she does not even notice it consciously. She thinks of what she wants to say in her native language first. Then she begins translating that sentence, word by word, into English. She checks the grammar. She rearranges the word order, because word order in her native language is different from English word order. She searches for the correct English equivalent of an idiom that does not directly translate. And only after all of this internal work is complete does she finally speak. This entire process might only take 2 or 3 seconds, but in a live conversation, 2 or 3 seconds of silence feels enormous, both to Amara and to the person she is speaking with. It makes her sound hesitant, unsure, even though she actually knows a great deal of English. This is the translation trap, and if you recognized yourself in Amara's story, I want you to know that this is one of the most common patterns among intermediate and even advanced English learners, and it is also one of the most fixable once you understand exactly why it happens and exactly how to dismantle it. Here is the core problem with translation as a speaking strategy. Your native language and English are not simply 2 different sets of vocabulary attached to the same underlying structure. They are 2 entirely different systems with different grammar rules, different word orders, different idiomatic expressions, and often different ways of organizing thought itself. When you translate word by word, you are essentially trying to force English words into your native language's grammatical structure, and this frequently produces sentences that are grammatically incorrect, unnatural sounding, or simply take far too long to construct. Even when the translation succeeds and produces a correct sentence, the process itself is inherently slow because you are running 2 entire language systems simultaneously, generating a thought in one language and then converting it into another, rather than generating the thought directly in English. The deeper issue, though, is what this habit does to your neural pathways over time. Remember what we discussed in the previous chapter about pathways being strengthened through repetition. Every single time you translate in your head before speaking English, you are practicing and strengthening the translation pathway, not the direct English production pathway. You are, in effect, training yourself to become extremely skilled at rapid mental translation, rather than training yourself to think and speak in English directly. This is why some learners who have relied on translation for years become remarkably fast translators in their own minds, yet they never quite reach true automatic fluency, because fluency requires a direct pathway from thought to English speech, without a translation step in between. And that direct pathway can only be built by practicing thinking in English itself. So how do we escape the translation trap? The solution is not simply telling yourself to stop translating, because that instruction alone rarely works. Telling yourself not to translate is like telling yourself not to think of a pink elephant. The habit is too deeply automated to be removed through willpower alone. Instead, we need to actively build a competing pathway, a direct English thinking pathway, strong enough that it becomes faster and more natural than the translation pathway. Here is exactly how we do that. The first technique is called direct association training. Instead of learning new English words by pairing them with their translation in your native language, which actually reinforces the very translation habit we are trying to eliminate, you learn new words by pairing them directly with images, actions, sensations, or definitions in simple English. For example, instead of learning that the English word exhausted means the same as the equivalent word in your native language, you instead picture in your mind a person who has just finished running a marathon, completely out of energy, barely able to stand. You feel the tiredness. You associate the English word directly with the feeling and the image, with no native language step in between. This might feel slower and more effortful at first, because you are building a brand new pathway rather than relying on the old, well-worn translation headway. But with repetition, this direct association pathway becomes faster and faster, until eventually, hearing or needing the word exhausted brings the image and feeling directly to mind in English with no translation required at all. The second technique is called narrating your day in English, and this is one of the most powerful exercises I give to every single one of my students, because it directly trains the skill of generating thoughts in English rather than translating them. Throughout your day, as you go about ordinary activities, making coffee, walking to work, washing dishes, waiting for a bus, silently narrate what you are doing in simple English, in real time. I am making coffee, the water is boiling, I need to find my keys, where did I put my phone? This might feel strange or even a little silly at first, and that is completely normal. But what you are actually doing, every single time you do this exercise, is practicing the direct generation of English thought without ever touching your native language. You are building that neural highway we discussed, one repetition at a time. And because you are doing this dozens or even hundreds of times throughout an ordinary day, the pathway strengthens remarkably quickly. The third technique is called the delay and replace method, and this one is specifically for moments when you catch yourself translating in real time during a conversation. The moment you notice that you have started constructing a sentence in your native language with the intention of translating it, pause for just a half second and instead of completing the translation, ask yourself the simple question, how would I say this idea, even a simpler version of it, directly in English? You are not aiming for a perfect translation of your original native language sentence. You are aiming to express the same underlying idea using whatever English words come to you directly, even if the resulting sentence is simpler or less sophisticated than what you originally intended to say in your native language. This is an extremely important mental shift. Many learners resist speaking simply because they want to express a complex, nuanced thought exactly as they would in their native language, and when they cannot immediately translate that complexity into English, they freeze rather than simplify. But native speakers simplify their thoughts constantly in casual conversation. Simple, direct English spoken fluently and confidently is always more effective communication than complex, sophisticated English that arrives 3 seconds late after an obvious internal translation process. I want to leave you with one final and very important reframe before we move to the next chapter. Every time you resist the urge to translate and instead reach directly for English, even if the sentence that comes out is imperfect, simple, or grammatically imprecise, you are doing something enormously valuable. You are strengthening the direct English pathway and weakening your dependence on the translation pathway. This does not happen overnight, and there will be moments of frustration where translation feels faster and easier, because in that specific moment, it genuinely is faster, since that pathway is currently stronger. But every single time you choose the direct route instead, you are casting a vote for the future automatic fluency you are working toward. Over weeks and months of consistent practice, the direct pathway becomes the stronger one, and translation naturally falls away, not because you forced yourself to stop, but because you no longer need it. In our next chapter, we are going to build on this foundation with one of the single most effective techniques ever discovered for training automatic, native-like speech patterns, a method used by professional interpreters, polyglots, and elite language learners around the world, called shadowing. The power of shadowing. If I could only teach you one single technique for the rest of your English learning journey, one exercise that would do more to build automatic speech than any other method I know, it would be shadowing. I have seen this technique transform hesitant, translation-dependent speakers into confident, fluent communicators faster than almost anything else, and yet most learners have never even heard of it, let alone practiced it correctly. So let us fix that right now. Shadowing is a technique where you listen to a native speaker and simultaneously repeat what they are saying out loud at the same time or with only a very short delay, matching their rhythm, their intonation, their speed, and their pronunciation as closely as possible. This is different from simply repeating a sentence after you hear it completed. In true shadowing, you are speaking almost at the same moment as the recording, like a shadow following a body, close behind, matching every movement. This might sound difficult, and honestly, the first few times you try it, it will feel extremely difficult and even a little chaotic. Your brain will struggle to listen and speak simultaneously. You will lose your place. You will mumble through words you do not fully catch. This is completely normal, and I want you to expect this discomfort rather than being discouraged by it, because this discomfort is actually a sign that the exercise is working exactly as it should. Let me explain why shadowing is so extraordinarily effective, connecting it back to everything we discussed about the brain in our earlier chapters. Shadowing simultaneously trains multiple systems that are usually developed separately and slowly through years of passive exposure. First, it trains your listening comprehension at natural native speed, forcing your ear to process English the way it is actually spoken in real conversations, not the slowed down, carefully articulated English often used in beginner learning materials. Second, it trains your mouth muscles, your tongue, your lips, your jaw, to physically produce the sounds, rhythms, and intonation patterns of English speech. This is crucial because English has sounds and stress patterns that may not exist at all in your native language, and your speech muscles need repeated physical practice to learn how to produce them accurately and quickly. Third, and this is perhaps the most powerful benefit, shadowing completely bypasses the translation trap we discussed in the previous chapter, because there is simply no time to translate. You must speak in the exact rhythm of the recording, which means your brain is forced to process and produce English directly, without any detour through your native language. Fourth, shadowing trains what we might call the automatic response system, the part of your brain that needs to produce speech quickly, under time pressure, exactly as happens in real conversation, rather than the slow, deliberate, thoughtful pace of traditional classroom exercises. Let me walk you through exactly how to shadow correctly, step by step, because doing it correctly makes an enormous difference in how much benefit you receive from this exercise. Step 1 is choosing the right material. For shadowing, you want audio or video content that features clear, natural spoken English, ideally at a pace that is challenging but not completely impossible for your current level. This could be a podcast, a YouTube video, a movie scene, or a news broadcast. If you are a beginner, choose slightly slower content, perhaps content designed for learners but featuring natural sentence rhythms rather than robotic, overly simplified speech. If you are intermediate or advanced, choose authentic native content, interviews, podcasts, or films, ideally content that interests you personally, because you are going to be listening to the same short clip many times, and genuine interest will keep you motivated through the repetition. Step 2 is choosing a short segment. Do not attempt to shadow an entire 20-minute podcast episode. Select a short clip, somewhere between 30 seconds and 2 minutes, that you can work with intensively. Shorter, more focused segments practiced repeatedly are far more effective than long segments practiced only once or twice. Step 3, and this is a step many learners skip but should never skip, is listening to the segment several times first without speaking at all, simply to familiarize yourself with the content, the vocabulary, and the general meaning. If there are unfamiliar words, look them up. You want to understand what is being said before you attempt to shadow it, because shadowing unfamiliar content that you do not understand at all provides much less benefit. Comprehension and production practice work best together, not in isolation. Step 4 is the actual shadowing practice. Play the audio and begin speaking along with it as simultaneously as you can manage, matching the speaker's pace, rhythm, and pronunciation as closely as possible. Do not worry about getting every single word perfectly correct on your first attempt. Your goal in the beginning is simply to keep pace, to match the general rhythm and flow, even if you mumble or approximate certain words. This is not a test. There is no one watching or judging you. This is training, pure repetition-based training, and like any physical training, your first attempts will be rough, and that is exactly how it should be. Step 5 is repetition. Shadow the same short clip multiple times, ideally somewhere between 5 and 10 repetitions in a single practice session. You will notice something remarkable happening as you repeat the clip. Each time through, you will catch more words, your mouth will move more accurately and more smoothly through the difficult sounds, and your overall rhythm will become closer and closer to the native speaker's natural pace. This is your neural pathway being built and strengthened in real time, exactly the process we described in Chapter 2, happening right in front of you in a single practice session. Step 6, for those who want to push their practice even further, is recording yourself shadowing and then comparing your recording to the original. This can feel uncomfortable at first. Many learners dislike hearing their own recorded voice, but this comparison is enormously valuable because it allows you to identify specific gaps between your pronunciation and the native pronunciation. Gaps you might not notice simply by feeling how the words come out of your own mouth. I want to address a concern that many of my students raise at this point, which is the worry that shadowing will simply teach them to mimic sounds without truly understanding or internalizing the language, that it is somehow a shallow, parrot-like exercise rather than genuine learning. This concern, while understandable, misunderstands how language acquisition actually works at the level of automatic speech production. Remember, automatic fluency lives in procedural memory, the same system responsible for physical skills. You do not become a skilled swimmer by thinking deeply about the physics of water resistance. You become a skilled swimmer by repeatedly practicing the physical movements until your body performs them automatically. Shadowing works the same way for speech. The physical, repetitive practice of producing English sounds, rhythms, and sentence patterns builds the automatic motor pathways that conscious study alone simply cannot build. This does not replace the need to understand grammar and build vocabulary, which remain important, but it addresses the piece that traditional study almost entirely ignores, the physical, automatic production of speech itself. I recommend that every single one of my students shadow for at least 15 to 20 minutes daily, consistently for a minimum of 8 weeks before evaluating the results. I say this because the changes shadowing produces, while sometimes noticeable within just a few days in terms of how natural certain phrases feel in your mouth, become truly transformative in your overall speaking fluency after weeks of consistent daily practice, as more and more neural pathways strengthen and myelinate through repetition. Students who commit to this practice consistently report a very specific and remarkable experience. They notice that certain phrases, certain sentence structures, certain intonation patterns simply start coming out of their mouth automatically in real conversations, without any conscious effort. Phrases they never deliberately memorized, but which became embedded through the sheer repetition of shadowing practice. This is exactly the automatic speech we have been discussing throughout this entire video, being built brick by brick, repetition by repetition, directly through this single powerful technique. Building the English thinking habit. We touched briefly on the idea of thinking in English in our chapter on the translation trap. But this concept is so central to achieving true automatic fluency that it deserves its own dedicated, deeper exploration. Because thinking in English is not simply a helpful supplementary habit. It is, in many ways, the ultimate goal of everything we are discussing in this entire video. Automatic speech is, at its core, the external expression of automatic thought. If your internal thinking process still runs primarily through your native language, your spoken English will always be limited by the speed of that internal translation bridge, no matter how much vocabulary you memorize or how many grammar rules you master. Let me explain what I mean by thinking in English, because this phrase is sometimes misunderstood. I am not suggesting that you need to achieve some mystical state where you never think in your native language again, or where your entire internal mental life transforms permanently into English. That is not realistic, and frankly, it is not even necessary. What we are aiming for instead is the ability to generate specific thoughts, particularly the kinds of thoughts related to everyday conversation, description, opinion, and narration, directly in English, at will, without the mandatory detour through your native language that we discussed in the Translation Trap chapter. This is a trainable skill, just like shadowing, and it responds beautifully to consistent, deliberate practice. The single most effective foundational exercise for building this habit is what I call continuous narration practice, and I introduced a simple version of this in the previous chapter when I mentioned narrating your day. Let us go much deeper into this technique now, because there is a specific, structured way to practice it that dramatically accelerates results. Begin with narrating simple, concrete, present moment actions. As you move through your day, describe to yourself, silently or in a quiet whisper if you are in a private space, exactly what you are doing, using simple present tense. I am opening the door. I am putting on my shoes. I am walking down the stairs. The simplicity of this language is intentional and important. Many learners resist this exercise because they feel that such basic sentences are beneath their actual English level, especially if they are intermediate or advanced speakers. But remember, we are not training vocabulary breadth here. We are training a completely different skill, the automatic generation of English thought in real time. And this skill develops most efficiently when the vocabulary itself requires zero conscious effort, freeing your mental resources to focus entirely on the process of thinking directly in English rather than being distracted by searching for difficult words. Once concrete present moment narration feels comfortable and relatively effortless, which for most students takes somewhere between 1 and 3 weeks of consistent daily practice, begin expanding into narrating your intentions and near future plans. I am going to make dinner soon. After this, I need to call my sister. I should probably clean my desk before I start working. This stage introduces future tense and modal verbs like should, need to, and going to naturally through genuine use rather than through memorized grammar drills, which is an enormously more effective way to internalize these structures because you are using them to express real, personally meaningful thoughts rather than completing an artificial textbook exercise. The next stage is narrating your opinions and reactions to what is happening around you. This is where things become significantly more interesting and considerably more useful for real conversation, because opinions and reactions are the actual substance of most everyday conversations you will have in English. As you go through your day, practice silently expressing your reaction to things. This coffee is too hot. I really like this song that is playing. That driver is going too fast. That seems dangerous. I am not sure I agree with what my colleague just said in that meeting. This stage trains you to access evaluative and opinion-based vocabulary and grammar structures directly in English, which is precisely the kind of language you need when someone asks you in a real conversation, "What do you think about this?" and you need to respond immediately, without a long pause, while you translate and construct your opinion internally first in your native language. The final and most advanced stage of this progression is narrating past events and telling stories to yourself in English. Describe something that happened to you yesterday, last week, or even years ago, as if you were telling the story to a friend. This morning I woke up late because my alarm did not go off. I had to rush to get ready, and I almost missed my train. This stage trains past tense structures, and importantly, it trains narrative fluency, the ability to tell a coherent, flowing story rather than producing isolated sentences, which is an extremely common real-world speaking demand, since so much of everyday conversation actually consists of telling each other stories about our day, our experiences, our lives. I want to share a specific technique that dramatically accelerates this entire process, something I call the 2-minute daily thought dump. Set a timer for 2 minutes and speak out loud in English, continuously, without stopping, about absolutely anything that comes to mind. It does not need to be organized. It does not need to make perfect grammatical sense. The only rule is that you cannot stop talking and you cannot switch to your native language, even internally. If you run out of things to say about one topic, immediately move to another. I do not know what to talk about right now. Let me think. Okay, yesterday I watched a movie. It was about a detective, I think, solving a crime in a city. I do not remember the name of the city. This might sound messy, and it is meant to be messy. The goal here is not eloquence. The goal is training your brain to keep generating English continuously under time pressure without the safety net of stopping to plan or translate. This single exercise, practiced daily for just 2 minutes, produces remarkably fast improvements in speaking fluency because it directly trains the exact skill that real conversation demands: continuous, real-time, unplanned speech production. One final important point before we move forward. Building the English thinking habit does not mean abandoning your native language or your native culture in any way. Bilingual and multilingual thinking is a beautiful, enriching cognitive skill, not a threat to your identity or your first language. What we are building here is simply an additional parallel pathway, a direct route to English thought and speech that exists alongside your native language, ready to be activated whenever you need it, particularly in the moments that currently cause you the most stress and hesitations. As this pathway strengthens through consistent practice, you will notice something wonderful happening. English will begin to feel less like a foreign system you are constantly translating into, and more like a second home, a second way of experiencing and expressing your thoughts, available to you naturally and automatically, exactly the way we have been describing throughout this entire video. The listening immersion method. Before we can produce automatic English speech, our brain needs an enormous, rich reservoir of English input to draw from, and this is precisely what today's chapter addresses. Many learners dramatically underestimate just how much listening input is required to build genuine fluency, and even more importantly, they often consume the wrong kind of input in the wrong way, which limits how much benefit they actually receive from all those hours spent listening. Let me begin with a number that surprises most of my students. Researchers studying language acquisition estimate that children acquire their native language after hearing somewhere between 10,000 and 15,000 hours of that language during their first several years of life, before they are even capable of producing complex, fluent sentences themselves. Now, I am not suggesting that you, as an adult learner with the benefit of conscious strategy and analytical ability, need anywhere close to that many hours to reach conversational fluency. Adults learn far more efficiently than infants, as we discussed earlier. But this number illustrates something important. Fluent, automatic language production requires an enormous foundation of input, far more than most learners realize, and certainly far more than the handful of hours per week that many learners currently dedicate to listening practice. The concept of comprehensible input, which I mentioned briefly in an earlier chapter, comes from the linguist Stephen Krashen, and it remains one of the most important and well-supported concepts in the entire field of second language acquisition. The core idea is straightforward. You acquire language most effectively when you are exposed to language input that you can mostly understand, but which contains some elements slightly beyond your current level. New vocabulary in a familiar context, a grammar structure you have not fully mastered, used in a way that makes its meaning clear through context. This slightly challenging, but mostly comprehensible input is often described using the formula I+1, meaning your current level, I, plus a small stretch beyond it. Input that is too difficult, where you understand very little, provides minimal benefit, because your brain cannot extract meaningful patterns from noise it does not understand. Input that is too easy, where you already understand everything perfectly, also provides limited benefit for continued growth, though it remains excellent for shadowing practice and building automaticity with already familiar material, which is a different and complementary goal. So how do you build an effective daily listening immersion practice? Let me give you a practical, structured approach that I have refined with hundreds of students over the years. First, diversify your listening sources deliberately. Many learners fall into the trap of listening to only one type of content, perhaps only slow, clearly articulated learner-focused podcasts, or perhaps only one particular YouTube channel they enjoy. While consistency with familiar content has real value, particularly in the early stages, your brain also needs exposure to a range of accents, speaking speeds, and contexts, formal and informal, scripted and spontaneous, in order to build truly flexible, robust comprehension that will serve you in the unpredictable variety of real-world conversations. I recommend incorporating at least 3 different types of content into your weekly listening practice. Something conversational and casual, like a podcast where people are chatting naturally, something more formal or structured, like a news broadcast or educational video, and something entertainment-focused, like a television show or film, ideally with English subtitles rather than subtitles in your native language, since reading native language subtitles while listening to English audio actually encourages your brain to rely on translation rather than direct comprehension. Second, practice what I call active listening sessions, as opposed to passive background listening. Passive listening, where English audio plays in the background while you are doing other tasks and not fully concentrating, has some minor value for familiarizing your ear with the general sound and rhythm of the language. But it produces relatively limited gains in actual comprehension and vocabulary acquisition, because your brain is not fully engaged in extracting and processing meaning. Active listening, by contrast, involves your full attention, ideally with a specific goal in mind. This might mean listening to a short segment and then writing a brief summary of what you understood. It might mean listening for specific vocabulary or grammar structures you are currently studying and noting every time you hear them used. It might mean pausing periodically to predict what the speaker will say next, based on context, and then checking whether your prediction was correct. These active engagement strategies dramatically increase how much your brain actually retains and internalizes from each listening session, compared to simply letting the audio play while your attention wanders. Third, and this connects directly back to our shadowing chapter, use your listening sessions strategically to identify shadowing material. As you listen actively to various content throughout your week, keep a running list of short segments, a particularly interesting sentence, an especially clear example of natural rhythm and intonation, a phrase you would like to be able to produce yourself, and use these segments as the raw material for your daily shadowing practice. This creates a beautiful reinforcing cycle. Your listening immersion identifies valuable input, your shadowing practice converts that input into automatic output ability, and your continuous narration practice, which we discussed in the previous chapter, gives you the opportunity to actually use these newly acquired patterns in your own spontaneous, self-generated speech. Fourth, I want to address a specific and very common concern among my students, which is the frustration of listening to native content and understanding only a fraction of what is being said, sometimes as little as 30 or 40%, which can feel discouraging and even demotivating. I want to reassure you that this experience, while uncomfortable, is a completely normal and even necessary part of the acquisition process, provided you approach it correctly. The key is not to demand perfect comprehension from every listening session. Instead, aim for what I call the productive struggle zone, content where you understand enough of the overall meaning to stay engaged and follow the general thread, even if specific words and phrases escape you. Over time, as your vocabulary and pattern recognition grow through consistent practice, your comprehension of that same type of content will noticeably increase. And this improvement, watching your comprehension percentage climb over weeks and months of consistent listening, is one of the most motivating and tangible signs of progress available to you as a learner. Finally, I want to emphasize consistency over intensity when it comes to listening immersion. 30 minutes of focused, active listening every single day produces dramatically better results over a period of months than 3 or 4 hours of listening crammed into a single weekend session, even though the total hours might eventually add up to something similar. This is because, as we discussed in Chapter 2, the strengthening of neural pathways through repetition benefits enormously from spaced, distributed practice rather than massed, concentrated practice. Your brain needs time between practice sessions to consolidate what it has learned, particularly during sleep, when memory consolidation processes are especially active. A learner who listens for 30 minutes daily is giving their brain 30 separate consolidation opportunities per month. A learner who listens for 4 hours once a week is giving their brain only 4 consolidation opportunities. The daily approach, even though it requires more discipline and consistency to maintain, produces far superior long-term results. And this principle, consistency over intensity, will come up again and again as we move through the remaining chapters of this video, because it applies not just to listening, but to every single technique we are discussing today. Speaking without fear. Now I want to turn to something that many English courses completely ignore, and yet in my many years of teaching, I have come to believe it is just as important as any grammar rule or vocabulary list we could ever study together. I am talking about fear, the specific, very real fear that grips so many English learners the moment they need to open their mouth in front of another person. If you have ever felt your heart racing before a conversation in English, if you have ever avoided a situation entirely simply because it required speaking, if you have ever rehearsed a simple sentence in your head 10 times before finally saying it, only for it to come out shakier than you intended, then this chapter is speaking directly to you. Let us return briefly to something we discussed in our very first chapter, the affective filter. Fear and anxiety are not just uncomfortable feelings that exist alongside your English ability. They are active, physiological blockers that interfere directly with your brain's capacity to access language, even language you have already learned and practiced extensively. When you feel afraid, your body releases stress hormones, your heart rate increases, your breathing becomes shallow, and critically, blood flow shifts away from the prefrontal cortex, the region of your brain responsible for complex language retrieval and organized thought, toward more primitive regions associated with immediate physical survival. This is precisely why you might know a word perfectly well, you might have used it correctly dozens of times in practice, and yet in the moment of a real, high-pressure conversation, that word simply refuses to surface. It is not gone. It is temporarily inaccessible, locked behind a door that fear has shut. Understanding this mechanism is enormously freeing because it tells us something crucial. The solution to speaking anxiety is not simply studying more vocabulary or grammar, hoping that more knowledge will somehow overpower the fear. The solution must directly address the fear itself, alongside the language training we have already discussed. Let me walk you through several specific practical strategies that I have used with students over many years. Strategies grounded in both psychology and language pedagogy that genuinely reduce speaking anxiety over time. The first strategy is what I call deliberate low-stakes exposure. Fear thrives in avoidance. Every time you avoid a speaking situation because it feels frightening, you send a powerful signal to your brain that the situation truly is dangerous, which only strengthens the fear response for next time. Conversely, every time you willingly enter a speaking situation, even a small, low-pressure one, and survive it, even imperfectly, you send the opposite signal, gradually teaching your nervous system that speaking English is not actually dangerous. The key here is starting with situations that are genuinely low stakes. This might mean speaking with a language exchange partner who is warm and patient, rather than a stranger who might judge you. It might mean recording yourself speaking alone before ever speaking to another person. It might mean joining an online conversation group specifically designed for learners, where everyone understands and accepts that mistakes are a normal, expected part of the process. Gradually, as your comfort grows in these lower stakes environments, you expand into slightly more challenging situations, a real conversation with a native speaker, a work presentation, a formal interview. This gradual exposure approach, moving from easier to more challenging situations at a pace that stretches you without overwhelming you, is one of the most well-established and effective methods across all of psychology for reducing any kind of anxiety, and speaking anxiety responds beautifully to this same principle. The second strategy involves directly reframing your relationship with mistakes, because for most anxious English speakers, the fear is not really a fear of the language itself. It is a fear of being judged, of appearing incompetent, of embarrassing themselves in front of others. I want to offer you a perspective that I have shared with thousands of students and which genuinely does shift how learners feel about speaking once they truly internalize it. Native speakers, in my extensive experience, overwhelmingly respond to non-native speakers attempting to communicate in English with patience, warmth, and genuine appreciation for the effort being made, not with the harsh judgment that anxious learners imagine. Think about your own experience. If you have ever encountered someone learning your native language and making an effort to speak it with you, even imperfectly, did you feel contempt or judgment toward them? Or did you feel a kind of warmth, an appreciation for their effort, perhaps even admiration for their courage in attempting to communicate in a language that is not their own? This is almost universally how people respond to language learners, and yet anxious learners consistently imagine the opposite, projecting a harsh judgment onto listeners that rarely actually exists. Every mistake you make while speaking is not evidence of failure. It is direct, valuable evidence that you are actively engaged in the exact process that builds fluency, the process of producing real, spontaneous speech under real conditions, which is precisely what strengthens the neural pathways we have discussed throughout this entire video. The third strategy is a specific breathing and physiological technique that you can use in the moments immediately before a speaking situation that feels particularly stressful, whether that is a job interview, an important phone call, or simply approaching a stranger to ask for directions. Before the interaction begins, take a slow breath in through your nose for a count of 4. Hold that breath gently for a count of 4, and then exhale slowly through your mouth for a count of 6, making your exhale slightly longer than your inhale. Repeat this 3 or 4 times. This specific breathing pattern activates your parasympathetic nervous system, the physiological system responsible for calming your body down, directly counteracting the fight or flight stress response we discussed earlier. This is not a psychological trick or a matter of simply thinking positive thoughts. It is a direct physiological intervention, and research in both psychology and performance science consistently demonstrates that this kind of controlled breathing measurably reduces the physical symptoms of anxiety, racing heart, shallow breathing, tense muscles within just a few minutes, which in turn restores blood flow to the prefrontal cortex and improves your access to language in that moment. The fourth strategy addresses a subtle but extremely common thought pattern among anxious speakers, which is what psychologists call catastrophizing, the tendency to imagine the absolute worst possible outcome of a speaking situation, and then respond emotionally as though that worst outcome were guaranteed or highly likely to occur. If I make a mistake, everyone will think I am stupid. If I cannot find the right word, the conversation will be a complete disaster. If my accent is noticeable, this person will lose all respect for me. I want you to notice, honestly and without judgment, whether thoughts like these run through your own mind before speaking situations. The technique to counteract catastrophizing is straightforward but requires consistent practice. When you notice one of these catastrophic thoughts arising, pause and ask yourself, realistically, what is the most likely outcome here? Not the worst possible outcome, but the most probable one, based on actual past experience. In the vast majority of cases, the realistic most likely outcome of a speaking situation, even one involving some hesitation or mistakes, is simply a normal, unremarkable conversation, perhaps with a small amount of friction, but nothing close to the catastrophic humiliation your anxious mind may be predicting. Consistently practicing this realistic reframing again and again over time genuinely retrains the automatic thought patterns that fuel speaking anxiety. Finally, I want to share what I consider the single most important mindset shift regarding fear and speaking. One that I ask every one of my students to hold on to throughout their entire learning journey. Confidence does not come before competence. This is perhaps the most common misunderstanding among anxious language learners, the belief that they need to feel confident first before they are ready to speak, as though confidence is some prerequisite condition that must be satisfied before action becomes possible. In reality, the relationship works in the opposite direction. Confidence is built through the accumulated experience of speaking, making mistakes, surviving those mistakes without catastrophe, and gradually improving. You do not wait until you feel confident to start speaking. You speak imperfectly and sometimes uncomfortably, and confidence arrives afterward as a direct result of that accumulated experience. Every single fluent English speaker you have ever admired went through this same uncomfortable process. There is no shortcut around it, but there is comfort in knowing that discomfort itself is not a sign that something is wrong. It is simply a sign that you are exactly where you need to be, doing exactly the work that produces the fluency you are working toward. Muscle memory for speech. I want to return now to something I mentioned briefly in our earlier chapters, but which deserves a full, dedicated exploration because it represents a piece of the fluency puzzle that almost no traditional English course ever properly addresses. Speaking English is not purely a mental or cognitive activity. It is also, quite literally, a physical, athletic activity involving precise, rapid, coordinated movements of your tongue, lips, jaw, and vocal cords, movements that must become automatic through repeated physical practice, exactly the way any other physical skill becomes automatic. Think about the sounds that exist in English but may not exist at all, or may exist in a somewhat different form in your native language. The English theayanst, as in think or this, requires placing your tongue between your teeth in a very specific way, a mouth position that simply does not exist in the sound inventory of many other languages. The English R sound is produced very differently from the R sound in many other languages, involving a curled tongue position that does not touch the roof of the mouth. Vowel sounds in English are remarkably numerous and often quite subtle in their distinctions. The difference between the vowel sound in ship and sheep, for example, is a distinction that many learners struggle to both hear and physically produce, simply because their native language does not require their mouth to make that particular subtle distinction. Here is the crucial insight I want you to absorb from this chapter. You cannot learn to produce these sounds correctly and automatically simply by understanding, intellectually, how they are supposed to be produced. Knowing that the th sound requires placing your tongue between your teeth does not mean your tongue will automatically go there quickly and correctly in the middle of a fast-flowing sentence, unless you have physically practiced that specific movement repeatedly until it becomes an automatic motor pattern, exactly the way a piano player's fingers learn the physical movements required for a particular chord progression, or the way a tennis player's arm learns the physical movement required for a proper serve. This is why I want to introduce you to a specific category of practice that I call articulation training, distinct from but complementary to the shadowing practice we discussed in an earlier chapter. While shadowing trains your overall speech production in the context of natural, connected speech, articulation training focuses specifically and deliberately on the individual sounds and sound combinations that are most physically challenging for speakers of your particular native language. Begin by identifying the specific sounds that are most difficult for you personally. This varies considerably depending on your native language, so I want to give you a general process for identifying your own particular challenges rather than a single universal list. Record yourself reading a short passage of English text aloud, then listen back carefully, or ideally, ask a native speaker or an advanced English teacher to listen and identify which specific sounds you consistently struggle to produce accurately. Common challenging areas across many different native languages include the th sounds we mentioned, the distinction between the L and R sounds, which is particularly challenging for speakers of certain East Asian languages, the distinction between short and long vowel sounds, which is challenging for speakers of languages with fewer vowel distinctions, and consonant clusters, multiple consonant sounds appearing together without a vowel between them, such as in words like strengths or twelfths, which can be physically awkward for speakers whose native language does not permit such clusters. Once you have identified your specific challenging sounds, practice them in isolation first, then in simple word pairs that highlight the distinction, and finally in full sentences that require you to produce the sound repeatedly and quickly in connected, natural speech. For example, if the distinction between the vowel sounds in ship and sheep is challenging for you, you might begin by practicing each sound in isolation, slowly and deliberately, paying close attention to the physical position of your tongue and the shape of your lips. Then move to minimal pairs, word pairs that differ only in this single sound, ship and sheep, sit and seat, live and leave, practicing each pair repeatedly until you can hear and physically feel the difference between them clearly. Finally, practice these words within full sentences, spoken at a natural conversational pace, which is ultimately the real-world context in which this physical skill needs to function automatically. I also want to emphasize the enormous value of exaggerated mouth movement practice, particularly in the early stages of training a new physical sound. When practicing a challenging sound, deliberately exaggerate the mouth movement required, moving your tongue, lips, and jaw further and more deliberately than you would in natural, relaxed speech. This exaggeration might feel unnatural or even slightly silly, which is exactly why many learners skip this step, but it serves an important physiological purpose. It builds stronger, more precise motor pathway control over the relevant speech muscles, in the same way that a weightlifter might practice a movement with exaggerated, slow control before performing that same movement with speed and power. Once the exaggerated version of the movement becomes comfortable and controlled, you gradually reduce the exaggeration until the movement becomes natural, relaxed, and appropriately sized for normal conversational speech. But the underlying motor precision built through the exaggerated practice remains, resulting in more accurate and consistent pronunciation even at natural conversational speed. I want to address one more important aspect of speech as a physical skill, which is the concept of mouth warm-ups, borrowed directly from the world of professional singing and public speaking, where performers understand very clearly that the muscles involved in speech production benefit from deliberate warming up, exactly the way an athlete warms up their body before intense physical activity. Before an important English-speaking situation, a job interview, an important meeting, a presentation, spend just 2 or 3 minutes doing simple mouth and tongue exercises, exaggerated vowel sounds, tongue twisters, rapid articulation of challenging sound combinations. This might feel like an unusual or even unnecessary step, but many of my students who have adopted this simple pre-speaking warm-up routine report a genuinely noticeable difference in how smoothly and confidently their speech flows in the crucial early minutes of an important conversation. Precisely the minutes when nervousness and cold, unwarmed speech muscles most commonly combine to produce hesitant, stumbling speech. The overarching principle I want you to take from this entire chapter is simple but profoundly important. Treat your mouth as an athlete treats their body. Speaking English fluently and automatically requires genuine physical skill built through genuine physical practice, not simply through intellectual understanding. When you combine this physical articulation training with the mental and emotional strategies we have discussed in previous chapters, direct English thinking, shadowing practice, fear reduction techniques, you are addressing every single dimension of what true automatic fluency actually requires: the neural pathways of thought, the emotional freedom from fear, and the physical muscular precision of speech itself, all working together in complete alignment. The 21-day rewiring routine. Throughout this video, we have covered a great deal of ground together. We have explored why your brain freezes, how neural pathways are actually built and strengthened, why translation slows you down, how shadowing rewires your speech production system, how to build the habit of thinking directly in English, how to structure effective listening immersion, how to work through speaking anxiety, and how to train your mouth as a physical, athletic skill. Now I want to bring all of this together into a single, clear, practical daily routine because I know from many years of teaching that information without a concrete plan of action tends to fade quickly, while a specific, structured routine, practiced consistently, produces real and lasting transformation. I am going to walk you through a 21-day structure, not because fluency magically arrives on day 22, but because 21 days of consistent daily practice is enough time for you to genuinely experience the beginning of the neural changes we have discussed throughout this video. Enough time to notice, tangibly and personally, that something is shifting in how English feels in your mouth and in your mind. Many of my students describe this specific milestone, roughly 3 weeks of consistent practice, as the point where they first notice certain phrases beginning to come out automatically, without conscious searching, a small but deeply encouraging signal that the rewiring process we have discussed is genuinely underway. Here is your daily practice structure, designed to take approximately 45 minutes to 1 hour per day, though it can be adjusted based on your available time, with the understanding that consistency matters more than total duration. Begin your day with 5 minutes of active listening, ideally over breakfast or during your morning routine. Choose a short segment of English content, a few minutes of a podcast or a short video, and listen actively with full attention rather than as passive background noise. This primes your brain for English at the very start of your day, activating the relevant neural pathways before you move into other daily activities. Next, dedicate 15 minutes to focused shadowing practice, using a short clip, ideally between 30 seconds and 2 minutes, that you repeat 5 to 10 times, following the step-by-step process we outlined in our shadowing chapter. If you are working on specific challenging sounds identified through the articulation training we discussed, incorporate a few minutes of exaggerated mouth movement practice on those specific sounds before or after your shadowing session. Throughout the remainder of your day, practice continuous narration in English, the technique we discussed in our chapter on building the English thinking habit. This does not require setting aside dedicated time, since it happens alongside your existing daily activities, making coffee, commuting, doing household tasks. Simply commit to narrating your actions, intentions, opinions, and eventually short stories about past events, silently or quietly, in English, as consistently as you can remember to throughout your day. In the early days of this 21-day routine, you might find yourself remembering to do this only occasionally. By the later days, particularly if you set periodic reminders on your phone, this habit will begin to feel considerably more natural and automatic. Set aside 10 minutes each day for the 2-minute thought dump exercise we discussed. Though I recommend doing this particular exercise multiple times throughout the day, rather than only once, perhaps once in the morning, once around midday, and once in the evening. Each time speaking continuously and without stopping for 2 full minutes about whatever comes to mind, deliberately resisting any urge to translate or to stop and search carefully for the perfect word. If possible, dedicate at least 15 minutes several times per week to actual conversation practice with another person, whether that is a language exchange partner, an online tutor, a conversation group, or simply a patient friend who is willing to converse with you in English. This real, live, unpredictable conversation practice is ultimately irreplaceable because it is the closest simulation to the actual real-world speaking situations you are training for. And it also gives you valuable opportunities to practice the fear reduction and low-stakes exposure strategies we discussed in our chapter on speaking without fear. Before any conversation practice or particularly important speaking situation during this 21-day period, use the breathing technique we discussed. 4 counts in, 4 counts held, 6 counts out, along with a brief mouth warm-up if time allows, to prepare both your nervous system and your speech muscles for the interaction ahead. Finally, And I consider this an absolutely essential component of the entire routine. Keep a brief daily reflection, even just 2 or 3 sentences, noting what felt easier today compared to previous days, what still felt difficult, and any specific words or phrases that came out automatically without conscious effort. A moment I encourage you to actively celebrate, because these small, accumulating victories are the concrete, tangible evidence that the rewiring process is genuinely working, even on days when overall progress might otherwise feel slow or invisible to you. I want to be honest with you about something important as you begin this 21-day routine. There will be days, probably several of them, where the practice feels tedious, where you do not notice any obvious improvement, where the old habits of translation and hesitation feel just as strong as ever. This is completely normal, and I want you to expect it rather than being discouraged by it. Neural rewiring, as we discussed in our earlier chapter on how the brain learns language, is a gradual, cumulative process, and the changes happening at the level of your neural pathways are not always immediately visible or noticeable in your conscious day-to-day experience, even while they are genuinely occurring beneath the surface, strengthened by every single repetition you complete. Trust the process, maintain consistency even on days when motivation feels low, and understand that the 21 days we are discussing here represent a beginning, a strong and meaningful beginning, but a beginning nonetheless, on a journey that continues to deepen and strengthen for as long as you continue this kind of deliberate, structured practice. Becoming an automatic English speaker. We have covered an enormous amount of ground together in this video, and I want to use this final chapter to bring everything together into a single, clear, unified understanding, because I believe that understanding the complete picture, how all these individual pieces fit together into one coherent system, is itself an important part of your transformation into an automatic, confident English speaker. Let us return to where we began. You freeze when speaking English, not because you lack talent or intelligence, but because of 2 specific, identifiable, and completely solvable problems. First, your procedural memory, the automatic system responsible for fluent speech production, has not yet received the kind of repeated physical practice required to build strong, fast, myelinated neural pathways for English. Second, anxiety and fear are actively interfering with your access to the language you have already learnt, shutting the door to your prefrontal cortex at precisely the moments when you need it functioning at its best. Throughout this video, we have addressed both of these problems directly and systematically through a complete interconnected set of tools. We discussed how understanding the actual neuroscience of language acquisition, pathways strengthened through repetition, myelination making those pathways fast and automatic, gives you a completely different and far more effective framework for approaching your own practice, moving away from simply memorizing more information and toward the deliberate, repeated production of English speech itself. We identified the translation trap as a hidden habit silently working against your fluency, and we discussed specific techniques, direct association, continuous narration, the delay and replace method, designed to build a direct English thinking pathway that bypasses translation altogether. We explored shadowing in depth, a single technique so powerful that it simultaneously trains your listening comprehension, your physical speech production, your natural rhythm and intonation, and your ability to produce English directly under real-time pressure, all at once, through simple, consistent, repeated practice. We built out a complete, staged approach to developing the habit of thinking directly in English, moving progressively from simple present moment narration through intentions, opinions, and finally, full narrative storytelling, alongside the powerful 2-minute thought dump exercise that trains continuous, unplanned speech production under time pressure. We discussed how to structure genuinely effective listening immersion, diversifying your input sources, practicing active rather than passive listening, and understanding why consistent daily practice produces dramatically better results than occasional intensive cramming sessions. We addressed the emotional and psychological dimension of fluency directly, understanding the physiological reality of the affective filter, and learning specific practical strategies, gradual exposure, reframing mistakes, controlled breathing, and countering catastrophic thinking to genuinely reduce the fear that has likely been holding you back for a long time. We explored the often overlooked physical athletic dimension of speech production, understanding that fluent pronunciation requires genuine muscle memory, built through deliberate articulation training and exaggerated practice, exactly the way any other physical skill is built. And finally, we brought all of these individual pieces together into a single, structured 21-day daily routine, a concrete, actionable plan you can begin implementing immediately, starting today, right after this video ends. I want to leave you with one final, and I believe deeply important thought as we close this class together. Automatic English fluency is not a distant, mystical destination reserved only for a fortunate few with some special natural gift for languages. It is a skill built entirely through understandable, replicable biological processes, the same processes that built your fluency in your native language, the same processes that allow any adult to acquire genuine, physical, automatic mastery of any complex skill, whether that is playing an instrument, learning a sport, or speaking a new language. You already possess everything required to build this skill. Your brain is fully capable of the neural rewiring we have discussed throughout this entire video. What has been missing until today was not talent, and it was not intelligence. It was simply a clear, accurate understanding of exactly how this process works, and a specific, structured plan for engaging with it consistently and correctly. I want you to think back one final time to that moment we discussed at the very beginning of this video. The moment of freezing, the racing heart, the silence where words should have been. I want you to understand that this moment does not define your relationship with English, and it certainly does not define your capability. It was simply a snapshot of where your neural pathways happen to be at that particular point in your journey. Pathways that are entirely capable of change, entirely capable of strengthening, entirely capable of eventually producing the smooth, confident, automatic English speech you have been working toward. That transformation begins with the very next choice you make after finishing this video. Whether you close this tab and move on with your day exactly as before, or whether you take just 15 minutes right now, today, to begin your first shadowing session, to begin narrating your next few actions silently in English, to take that first concrete, physical step toward the rewiring we have discussed together. I have taught this material to thousands of students over many years, and I can tell you with complete confidence, based on that extensive experience, that the students who succeed are not the ones with the most natural talent, or the highest test scores, or the most expensive courses. They are simply the students who commit to consistent, correctly structured daily practice, exactly the kind of practice we have outlined together throughout this video, and who trust the process even through the inevitable days when progress feels slow or invisible. You have everything you need to become one of those students starting today. Thank you for spending this time with me. This has been English Mind Training with Professor Henry, and I will see you in the next class, where we will continue building on everything we have covered here today.